Joshua at the moment, and this is right at the beginning of Joshua chapter 1. If you've got a Bible, get it out and find it. It's in the Old Testament. Or if you've got an app on your phone, open it up. You can read it along with me. I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Last week I wandered around the stage reading it and went completely off camera. So I've been told to stay where I am this morning. I'm starting at verse 1. After the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant. He said, Moses, my servant, is dead. Therefore, the time has come for you to lead these people, the Israelites, across the Jordan River into the land I'm giving them. So this was after 40 years of waiting. The time had come. It was time to move. I don't know how you're feeling this morning. Some of you might feel like you've been waiting for something from God for a long time. And the question is, are you ready to move when He gives the command? As I was reading those verses this week, those 4 words jumped out at me. We've been singing them already this morning. The time has come. The time has come. Maybe that means something specific to somebody here. The time has come. If so, now is the time to get courageous. Verse 3, I promise you what I promised Moses. Wherever you set foot, you will be on land I've given you. From the Negev wilderness in the south to the Lebanon mountains in the north. From the Euphrates River in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, including all the land of the Hittites. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live. For I will be with you as I was with Moses. I will not fail you or abandon you. I mean, how strong, vivid, and clear are those promises, by the way? Surely that would make your confidence soar. It should. But then we read from verse 6, be strong and courageous, for you are the one who will lead these people to possess all the land I swore to their ancestors I would give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the instructions Moses gave you. Do not deviate from them, turning either to the right or to the left. Then you will be successful in everything you do. Study this book of instruction continually. Meditate on it day and night, so you will be sure to obey everything written in it. And only then will you prosper and succeed in all you do. So these promises of God, by the way, they were contingent on Joshua and the people actually knowing God's word and being obedient to it. And we're going to be looking at bold obedience next week. But these promises were not just something to name and claim. They had to be taken up. They had to be walked in. And that takes courage in 2 ways. Joshua needed courage to face the opposition that they were going to face when they went into the land, but he also needed the courage just to do things God's way. I mean, both have their challenges. And finally, verse 9. This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. You know, fear and discouragement will come. That is a given. But they don't have to take you out when you know God is with you. So we're spending a few weeks seeing what we can learn from the life of Joshua when it comes to living a bold life. I mean, he was a man who knew who he was. This is what we were looking at last week. He was well aware of the slavery that he had been saved from, but he was much more focused on where he had been saved to and what he had been saved for, which was to possess the land that had been promised to God's people. It said he would give it to them. And Joshua had a bold faith that trusted God and believed what he said. And it was a faith that defied what he could just see with his eyes. It defied all the obstacles that he could see in his way. And that's what we looked at last week, this call to be bold, to live with that same strong, vivid, and clear appearance, a holy confidence that my life is in God's hands. Either you believe that or you don't. And he can use me in whatever way he sees fit. And it's great to have that bold faith and to use language that makes statements in accordance with what God says. But at some point, what we say we believe has to be more than words. It has to become action. We need to do more than just talk the talk. We need to walk the walk. And the reality is that those steps will be daunting. They will. And we're going to need a bold courage if we're going to keep moving forward. I mean, for Joshua, this was the reality that he faced, was that when they finally came back to entering the land 40 years after they missed the opportunity, in all that time that Israel had been wandering around the wilderness, you know, the inhabitants of the land that God had promised he was going to give them, they hadn't miraculously disappeared. They were still there. What was scary and seemingly impossible back then was still there to be confronted and overcome now. You know, avoidance never works. I don't know if you found that. It doesn't resolve anything. It just leads to a lesser life. It leads to a more limited life. So, I mean, are there situations that you've been avoiding? Conversations you should have had, things you wished you'd done, but fear has just got in the way. You know, the answer is never to avoid what makes you feel anxious or fearful. It's to confront it. I know that's not what anybody wants to hear this morning because we all want to run away from it. But we can confront it in the knowledge that God is with us. You're not doing this on your own. You know, Jesus said this. This is from the Amplified version. It's not actually on the screen. This is a bonus verse for you. Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, my own peace I now give to you." He said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." He said, "Neither let them be afraid." Stop allowing yourselves to be agitated and disturbed. Do not permit yourselves to be fearful and intimidated and cowardly and unsettled. Strong words from Jesus, because sometimes we feel it's out of our control. Those feelings are so strong. But you know what? Courage is not a feeling. Courage is a decision. We don't wait till we feel strong and courageous. He commanded Joshua to be strong and courageous. Bold courage says, I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to do what God says, regardless of how daunting it looks and feels. But courage only comes from bold faith, what we were talking about last week. I'm not talking about just blindly engaging in risky behaviors. I'm talking about responding to God's call, trusting in His promises, even though the terrain ahead might look difficult. Because have you noticed that to grow our faith, God doesn't make it easy? Some of you have learned that. Nelson Mandela once said, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear." You know, I remember my daughter, Rowan, she'll kill me for saying this, but she started a new job a few years ago. And she was feeling really anxious, to the point where after a few days, she said she wasn't going to go anymore. Why would I want to do something that's making me feel so horrible? It was words like that she used. Why would I want to do something that's making me feel so horrible? Do you know, I think we all ask that question at times, because we don't often see the bigger picture, or consider how this might be growing us and stretching us, when all we can see and feel is horrible. I remember driving Rowan to that job after she told me she wasn't going to go, telling her that she could not let the feelings win, because there were bigger things at stake here, and she needed to give the job some time for those feelings to pass. And they did, and she stuck with that job for another year. But actually it wasn't about the job. It was about learning that if I just take some courage, then the fear cannot win. I mean, we all need to learn that lesson if we're going to see the greater things that God says he has for us. Now, fear will always try and stop you pursuing God's purposes. It's one of the enemy's strategies. I don't know if you know these verses from 1 Peter 5:7-9. It says, give all your worries and cares to God. I mean, thank God that he's there to take them if we'll give them to him. Stay alert. Watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Stand firm against him and be strong in your faith. You know, the roar of a lion, it has the potential to paralyze. Are we there, Neil? The roar of a lion has the potential to paralyze the little animals so that they become easy prey. We've got to be alert to that. We've got to be strong in faith and courageous in battle. What is roaring at you? What is trying to paralyze you? What is getting in the way of you finding the courage to do what God is calling you to do? Are you all right there, Linda? Because I'll tell you some of the things that get in the way. Fear of failure, fear of inadequacy, fear of rejection, fear of looking foolish, fear of what people might think or say, fear of getting it wrong, fear of upsetting someone, fear of death. I could go on. These are all fears that I've encountered. I don't know about you. I mean, if you remember from 40 years earlier, when Joshua had spoken up to say that they could and they should take the land right there and then because God had promised they could, the people talked about stoning him. How unfair was that? He was being faithful to God. He was doing the right thing. He was saying the right thing. He was exercising bold faith. But in that moment, it just seemed to get him into more trouble. And the people wouldn't listen to him. They wanted to kill him. Do you ever feel like that? You've tried to overcome your fears, but they just come back and roar at you louder. Stop a minute. I mean, Joshua is a real example to us to keep being bold and courageous, even if in the short term you don't see the results you're expecting. Don't give up. This is not your final destination. You will have to continue confronting those same fears at times. For Joshua, that meant having to get up once again and tell the people what God wanted them to do. I mean, fear will roar. What makes you think they're going to listen to you this time? They're going to want to kill you again. Who do you think you are? You can't do this, it's too dangerous. That's what fear will tell you. You know, millions of individuals, at one time or another, they suffer from some form of social anxiety. They fear being negatively evaluated in anything they do. They fear being humiliated and rejected. They fear being abandoned. You know, when faced with standing up in front of a group of people, we break into a sweat because we're afraid of rejection. I feel it every single Sunday morning. At a primal level, the fear is so great because we're not just merely afraid of being embarrassed or judged, we're afraid of being rejected from the social group. You know, a few years ago, back in 2012, some of you have heard this story, but my nephew suggested to me, he said, I reckon God wants to use you to speak. And I just dismissed it. I thought, no, I'm not putting myself out there, not putting myself up in front of people. And he said, if you don't say something to James, then I will. He was only a teenager at the time, bless him. So one morning I was on my way to work and I texted James saying, would it be okay if I spoke on one occasion? And it was literally as simple as that. I got to work and I got in my office. My heart was like waiting for this response. I don't know what I expected him to say. No way. That's probably what I was expecting. And he sent me back this little text saying, yeah, that sounds great, let's get a date. That was it. But in that moment, it felt like a turning point in my life. I can't even describe it. I sat in my office, feeling really anxious, waiting for his reply, and then he replied, and then I felt even more anxious because now I've got to actually do it. And it was, gosh, if I hadn't made that call, I wonder where I'd be now. I mean, was it scary? Was it scary? Yes. And you know, it still is a lot of the time. But I think I've just learned to ignore those feelings and not allow them to paralyze me and roar at me anymore. You know, put me in a new situation though, like when we had prayer week at the beginning of the year and we had a lot of different churches meeting together, or when I did my first wedding last year or my first funeral recently, and suddenly all that anxiety sort of is magnified again, and I still have to fight through it. There's a very famous book title which has become something I've said to myself a lot, and I've said to a lot of people, and that book title is Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. Feel the fear. Do it anyway. You know, when I sensed that God was telling me to do a degree many years ago, in my 30s, I wrestled with that thought before I agreed to it, because I've never been an academic. I never trusted my ability or my opinion at school. I always stayed quiet in the classroom. I was always worried that I was going to look foolish. And suddenly I was putting myself back into that environment. Was it daunting? Was it a battle? Was it painful and uncomfortable a lot of the time? You bet, it was. It was. You know, I wasn't the university type, so I thought. You know, when I applied to go to college after I finished school, I got rejected by every single college. So I didn't make the grade. And yet, as I made that choice at that moment when God said, I believe God was telling me to do it. As I stepped out, as I walked it, one step at a time, one assignment at a time, that's all I could look at. I confronted my fear of failure and my fear of inadequacy. And I believe I entered a bigger life. I entered into something that God wanted me to possess. And it taught me to trust God more. You know, without winning some of those earlier battles in my life, I don't think I would have found the courage to do the things that I'm doing now. I really don't. And this is what Joshua consistently heard from God. This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. If God commanded it, then it must be possible, right? He didn't say it would be easy. You're going to need some strength to do it. But he also didn't say that you're on your own. He always reminded us that he was there. He always reminded Joshua that he was with him. And he says the same to each one of us this morning. I put out a message earlier in the week just to a few people across church, just saying, if you've got a testimony, something that you could share, and to about some way where you've stepped out in faith and it's taken some courage. So, firstly, Stuart's going to come and share with us.
Hello. So, I'm someone who, if I'm given the opportunity to explain or make a case for why someone should be a Christian, I'll try and take the opportunity. It's a great skill to learn, and it's one that I really try and use. And to be honest, it's a bit easier to do that when I don't know you, or I know you very well, and you know where I'm coming from. But it's harder when we've been friends for years, decades actually, and you kind of know I'm a Christian, but we've never really spoken about it, but we've been through a lot together, and I really care about you and I really value our friendship. That might sound a bit bizarre to say, but making or taking the opportunity at that point is quite scary. It's harder. Why? Because I'm scared I'm going to say something that will ruin our friendship. Maybe you won't want to be friends with me anymore. Maybe you'll be insulted by something that I accidentally say, or the way I say it. Does that make sense? So these days, just because of where I am at the moment, I tend to do this online, a bit through my blog and Facebook and whatever. And I had the opportunity with my friend Mike this week to embark on explaining why it makes sense to be a Christian. And I did have to think about it. Do I go into this? But we did. We had a conversation this week. It was scary. I'll be honest with you. It was scary going into it because I've known Mike for 20 years. I know some of the things he's going through in his life at the moment. I do care about him. He's not a Christian. How did the conversation go? Well, I guess two things. It was positive in the sense that we talked about some really important things. And we went into areas in our relationship that we hadn't been to before, really about Stuart talking about why being a Christian makes sense. And Mike responding to that. So that's positive. It was also painful because Mike is anti-Christianity for many reasons. Some of which I understand, some of which I don't. Even though his arguments didn't make sense for why he didn't want to be a Christian, they hurt. They hurt me as I was listening to them. And it felt painful a lot of the time. Just ask Janet, a lot of the conversation was painful. But where has it left me as a person as I've taken my courage in my hands and done this with Mike? Well, I think a couple of things, just to finish, right? The first thing is, God's reminded me of the verses in the Bible, and this happens in the Bible a number of times. God says, the battle is the Lord's. It's not mine. It's not my crusade. It's not my fight. At the end of the day, it's between Mike's heart and God. That's where the battle lies. And God's invited me into that battle this week. So that's encouraging. And the second thing it's encouraged me is, Stuart, don't take it so personally when he puts out a lot of, I guess the word I would use is peak. Does that make sense? He's kind of very pointed in he's trying to just put it down and avoid it, having to think about it in quite an aggressive way sometimes. And he's learned that. Don't take it personally, Stuart. This is God he's speaking to at the end of the day, even though I'm representing him. So, took courage. It's been positive. It's worth doing, definitely. Thank you.
I just realised the other person who was going to get out this morning isn't actually here. I'm not going to say it was, but maybe they bottled it. I don't know, maybe they got too nervous. I hope not. I'll check on it. Do you know what? I've often tried to fob God off with, it's not the right time. It's not the right time, just doesn't feel like the right time to do this. I seem to have this inbuilt gift of procrastination all the time. But God is saying, the time is now. The time is now. He's reminding us to look at him, to listen to him, and not what the circumstances look like. You know, if you read on in Joshua to chapter 3, when the Israelites are actually at the river Jordan, getting ready to cross into the promised land for that first time, they knew what they were going to confront when they got there, namely a huge fortified city called Jericho. That would be their first obstacle. But at the point they were at now, they still had no idea how they were even going to cross the river. And do you know what? This was the actual worst time of the year to be attempting this. In Joshua 3:15, it says it was the harvest season and the Jordan was overflowing its banks. It couldn't have been a worse time to try and cross the river. Usually that river, it's thought, was about 100 foot across, probably the length of this hall. 100 foot across, don't look too far. It was over 10 feet deep in places. And remember, this was the time of the year where it flooded, so it was a lot wider and deeper. But this didn't put Joshua off. He just trusted that God would have a plan. And so he stepped out with bold courage, gathering 40,000 troops by the River Jordan, telling the people, "Purify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do great wonders among you." Now talk about raising people's expectations. It takes courage when you're not exactly sure what God is going to do. And the people, thankfully on this occasion, didn't talk about stoning him. They believed him. And just as Joshua had told them, the very next day, as the priests who went ahead of the army took their first steps into the water, God performed just this most amazing miracle. And we're told that the water started backing up a great distance away, a town called Adam. And the water in front of them flowed away to the Dead Sea, just leaving this dry riverbank, meaning that everybody could cross over. Now God is building faith here in the people for all that was to come. But it took bold courage to step into the water, because they had to step into the water before the miracle actually happened. If you read the book of Acts, you'll see that the disciples, the early believers, they prayed for boldness, for courage. They didn't know what was going to happen next. And for many of them, their step of faith did mean intense persecution and even dying for Jesus. But they didn't want fear to stop them doing what God had called them to do. And they trusted that even if it was daunting, even if it required great sacrifice, that God would use it for his glorious purposes. And so they determined to be strong and courageous. They prayed for it. They didn't pray to be taken out of the situation. They prayed for boldness in the situation. And, just like Joshua, let's bring this back to Jesus. Jesus knew who he was. His name, Jesus, was the Greek form of the Hebrew word Yeshua, meaning the Lord is salvation. It's from the same name, Joshua. And he knew what he had been sent to do, to show God's sacrificial love, to be salvation for the world, by choosing to die on a cross in our place, to carry the weight of our sin and pay the death penalty for that sin. He knew what was coming. He knew what was coming. But there came a point, just before his arrest, he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, where the enormity of what faced him, it just became evident. And he said to his friends, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Jesus, he knows exactly what it is to be in that anxious state, to feel the fear. He knows it. He understands what you and I go through. And he asked God, if there was another way, take this cup from me. He knows what it is to look for the exit route, the escape route. But he kept at the forefront of his prayers, "Yet not as I will. Not as I will, but as you will." And when he returned to his friends, he uttered the immortal words, "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Don't we know that? That's the battle. The temptation is always to go for the more comfortable option, to avoid the pain. Jesus knew what that felt like, and yet he did not opt out. He showed us that the way of courage is possible. And after praying for a third time, he said to his disciples, "But look, the time has come. The time has come. This is not time to step away. This is not time to sink back. This is the time to step up, to be strong and courageous, to be bold if you want to see God's promises come to pass." Hebrews 12, 2-3 says this about Jesus. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. If you can see the joy ahead, if you can see the promise of God, then it will help to make the journey much more doable. Joshua could see the promise of God. That's what he had in his mind. He knew that that land was theirs. He knew that God was going to give it to them no matter what obstacles they were going to come up against. And it goes on in Hebrews 12 about Jesus. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people. Then you won't become weary and give up. So, in what ways do you need to be courageous this week, I wonder? The encouragement is to fix your eyes on Jesus. Do not fear. God is with you. Let's be a courageous people. Let's be a courageous church that God has called us to be. Let's keep moving forward. Because like Stuart said, it is worth it. It is so worth it. If there's things you particularly struggle with when it comes to fear, we have support here at church. We have something called Celebrate Recovery on a Thursday night. If there's fears which are literally paralyzing you, come and talk about them. If you can't come on Thursday, at least get together with someone you trust and pray. Pray about it. Talk about it. Don't let those fears take you out. Let's stand together and pray. Father, I know my heart. I know that, given the choice, I'll always go for the more comfortable option. Lord, I'm always looking for the escape route, truth be told. But Lord, I thank you that you have helped me. Thank you that I've known your presence with me. Thank you, Lord, that you have overcome the world. We don't need to fear. Thank you, Lord, for helping me to confront some of my fears. And Lord, I pray for anybody here this morning who is struggling with a particular fear that is just holding them back. Lord, I pray for that hope to rise up in them this morning. Lord, I pray that you would show them, Lord, that with you anything is possible. That with you we can be strong and courageous. And Lord, I pray that you give us that perspective. Give us that perspective of knowing your promise and holding on to your promises. Of seeing the bigger picture. Lord, that we wouldn't get taken out by the fear of the moment. Lord, would you continue to teach us? Would you continue to free us from these things? Lord, that we would enter the bigger life, the abundant life that you've promised, that we would know it. And for anyone who doesn't yet know Jesus this morning, I just want to say that he died for you too. He went through just the horror of crucifixion for you. He took your wrong. He took all the things that hold you back, that separate you from God. He took them upon himself so that you might be free. And all you need to do is just to believe in him, to say, Jesus, thank you. Lord, please come into my life. May I know your power within me. That same power that raised Jesus from the dead. May I know that in my life. May I know your presence. May I know your forgiveness. May I know what it is to have that new start. Lord, may I know who I am in you. And he says that if you believe in your heart, if you proclaim that Jesus is Lord, then you will be saved. You can know him. with you every single day.